Welcome to today's edition of Feet to the Fire, where we're always challenging the status quo. For more cutting-edge commentary, go to feettothefire.org. That is feet, the number 2, thefire.org. And now your host.
Yes, this is good stuff. Good to be here with you again, back for our Feet to the Fire program. Really excited. And, I realized I've been calling it a podcast, and it's not really only a podcast. That's one form that it's going to take in order to get this message out there, but essentially it's a program. So moving forward, we're going to call it that. And here we are in the midst of a discussion on the nature of American civilization, the form and function of American government, so that we can rightly defend our freedoms. We are holding educators and historians' feet to the fire for not teaching an accurate picture of the American identity. And in doing this, we are demolishing their pretensions and false narrative. Now, we ask this question: how are we classified? What is our political classification or definition? We learned we're not a pure democracy, but here's what we are: a confederated constitutional republic. Yes, another hearty yes for that. We cheered over the sublime and nerdy sophistication of that description. That in fact we are something very specific and deliberate and sophisticated, and something certainly worth knowing and defending. And we want to get excited in an intellectual way about the country that we know and love. So we said first we're a confederation, and that means divided government, divided between states and national, and even local for that matter. You've got township and county. Government is really, power is divided throughout our national and state identity. A confederation being a loose grouping or union of sovereign states under a limited and clearly defined national, or what we would call federal, government. The point being, we retain our statehood and states' rights. We are not a situation where we've surrendered our states' rights or identity or prerogative to the maniacal whims of a powerful few. This limited scope of the national government and the contrasting unlimited scope of the state's sovereignty and its constituent citizens is summed up in the 10th Amendment. We see this clearly in the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights. And it says this: the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Now, James Madison, who defended the U.S. Constitution against those who were worried that it would jeopardize state sovereignty, actually said this. Now, this is one of the fathers of the U.S. Constitution, who was pro-federalism, pro-national government, said this: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined, and those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. So even Madison, a strong advocate for a national constitution, defended the notion of a confederation. Now, I'm going to try and be as clear and brief on this program as I can, but we're going to move to the second aspect of American liberty, and that's constitutional. And what does constitutional mean? It means this: government by law. And while this may seem obvious and simplistic, it is revolutionary in its implications, and was indeed at the time of our founding. The reason is because of the very nature of law. Law is unyielding, it is blind, it is just, it is permanent, it is over everyone. This is the U.S. Constitution. That one document would govern in a permanent mandate the whole of civil society, from the peasant to the president. And that's why I get so excited, because it's so simple, but it is so all-encompassing and well-formed. Now, isn't that the nature of a civil society anyway? Law and order. That's the point of constituting something like a government, to make it lawful and orderly. The majority of human history prior to this was reckless tyrants acting outside of law. Now law in the United States would be placed over everyone to establish form and function in government. And herein lies the major point of divergence from the rest of humanity and history. All men would be governed by and held in restraint under a common, uniform constitution. Think of the meaning. This is how the government shall be constituted or framed. No departures accepted, because the Constitution, which is ratified, is agreed upon to be the supreme law of the land. And it says that in the Constitution regarding Congress. It is binding, it is fixed, it is transcendent, greater than and above all. Now you begin to see why power-hungry liberals hated the Constitution more than anything else. Because it is above them, it restrains them. Power-hungry people hate anything above them. In a legal and political sense, the Constitution is the object of liberals' greatest and most deliberate, most hostile attacks because it is the, not one of, but the single obstacle in the way of their efforts, a blockade that just won't budge and let them overrun the society. Law. 3 little letters making one word with such force. You gotta love it. By its very nature, law, impenetrable, immovable, a perpetual wall, a bulwark to liberty. Incidentally, it is law, constitutional law, that mandates and protects our Confederation. See, law is the source of every good thing politically and socially because it restrains corruptible man and preserves justice. And what we take for granted as normal and obvious, having uniform law, is actually very unique. This concept of overarching law to which all men are accountable is specifically Judeo-Christian in origin. It originates with the nature of God and his order. He is a God of law, a God of order. He invented law, and unfortunately, man spurned it. But wasn't that the Old Testament? Wasn't that how he constituted the nation Israel? A written code? They were unique from all other nations because they had rules to live by, as opposed to everyone do what he thinks is right, or do whatever the king says, which is how all the other nations were living. The Old Testament functioned as a form of constitution for Israel, and it had wonderful attributes, has wonderful attributes, which our founders and we as Americans drew from. The Old Testament law, simple, short, clear, binding over all behavior and all of life, over all political life. Very similar, is it not, to our Constitution in its simplicity and precision. Our Constitution is short and clear and precise. It's only a couple pages. So constitutional government by law is a divine thing, a form of government inspired by God's order and character. But why divergent from humanity? Because the rest of humanity has pretty much always followed the principle of, quote, might makes right. And that actually is what Dinesh D'Souza calls the Conquest Principle. And if you don't know him or haven't heard him talk about that, you got to check out the movie that came out this summer called America, Imagine the World Without Her. And he talks about how the Conquest Principle has pretty much governed all of civilizations for all of human history. And here it is, that if you are stronger and have more money or weapons, then kill the little guy. Rule him how you want. Take his stuff, take his wife, enslave his kids. There's no accountability to law in the Conquest Principle. There's no one to answer to. Do whatever you want. It's the same idea behind the divine right of kings, which the founders rejected, that kings had a divine right from God to basically do whatever they wanted. The king is above the law. He isn't governed by law. He is the law, because whatever he says goes. Law isn't over him. It comes out of his mouth. And the idea of a constitution flies in the face of this kind of tyranny and oppression. A constitution says all men are bound under the rules of this civilization, and all are held and judged accordingly. All are equal, the prince and the pauper. This actually, a constitution, codifies the concept of equality or equal rights, because all are necessarily equal when a law is in place. It means by its very nature a universal rule for everyone. See now why constitutional is so epic and so unique? No more rotten dictators. All men are accountable. All men will have to play by the same rules, and the Constitution sets forth those rules plainly. All men will have their feet held to the fire, which is why our current presidency with President Obama is so horrendous, because President Obama doesn't play by the rules, doesn't play by the rules of the Constitution, but violates them every chance he gets. He is truly an outlaw president, and his regime is an outlaw administration. But now, since liberals can't get rid of the Constitution, since we have a binding Constitution over all of society that's been in place for a couple hundred years now, and they can't get rid of it, what do? They bend it, they change it, they manipulate it, and they try and reform it. Under what pretext? Well, under this great deception that is pumped through our schools, and now everybody is under this notion or presumption that this is what our Constitution is. And here's the great deception. They call it a living, breathing document. You ever hear that? That is one of the greatest deceptions ever promulgated by our historians. That's how you get around law. Change its definition from fixed to fluid. It doesn't mean what it says. It's living, breathing. It changes. It's fluid. That's the whole philosophy behind judicial activism, or what's called loose construction, a loose interpretation of the Constitution versus strict construction or originalism. Originalism means this: the founders and the guys who wrote it said what they meant, and they meant what they said. And the Constitution needs to be interpreted that way. Interpreted as words written in stone, not breathing, but ironclad. Ironclad, written in stone. Man, that sounds an awful lot like some other great arrangement of law from history, right? Written in stone, never to be tampered with. That's right. The Ten Commandments, Old Testament law. Very simple, on 2 stone tablets. That's how God did it, and we imitated that in America with a law over men. Living, breathing is directly contrary to the implicit meaning of the word law, which is fixed. Law means fixed. Unchanging law renders unchanging judgment, which is the essence of justice and fairness and equity. What is the law today will be the law tomorrow and the day after, with the same results for every and all people, everywhere, equally at all times. Law means permanent justice. And if it isn't fixed or permanent, but changes or fluctuates, if it's fluid, living and breathing, then it isn't law, it's something else. Fixed law is why our Constitution can only be changed by a very difficult amendment process. It's intended to be that way. The founders wanted it to be hard to change it because law is supposed to stay. But under judicial activism, you can get any change you want. You can change the meaning and get it to say whatever you want it to say without actually changing the ink on the paper. That's where liberals come out with these outlandish claims about what's in the Constitution. They use it to excuse their empowerment of the national government to expand its authority over our liberty. They invent stuff out of thin air, new rights, new federal powers, new whatever they want. Here's some examples: a right to privacy, a right to abortion, right to marital choice, a power for the government to regulate every bit of state and personal commerce, including how much wheat a farmer grows on his farmland, a right to unionize, a right to fair pay, or they call it minimum wage, or they give it a nicer spin, living wage, a right to a retirement. FDR talked about that in his second Bill of Rights. Essentially, everybody has a right to a retirement. Power to regulate health care. That's what we see in Obamacare. A power to regulate personal habits, like how much soda you can drink in New York City. Power to regulate schools. Power to regulate education, the environment, public religious expressions. It goes on and on and on. It never ends. And the justification is they just call all this stuff penumbras or shadow doctrines. It's just a fancy way to say they read between the lines. It's not actually in the Constitution, but we felt like jamming it in there. So we're just going to say it's implied. And then they deny the actual rights and powers that are in there, black and white on the page, like our right to firearms or our right to free religious expression in private and in public. Judicial activism, the main strategy by which the left implements its agenda, is in direct contrast and opposition to the very nature of our system, which is constitutional law. So I guess we just held judges' feet to the fire too. All right, that's it. A confederation guaranteed by a constitution with one more aspect to go. Stay tuned for the third pillar of American liberty, what we call republicanism. Not the party, the idea. But it is a pretty good name for a party. Until then, let justice roll down like waters, America, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And let's get a little bit of that constitutional justice back, too. Don't believe the hype out there. Open your mouth, especially if you're around a maniacal activist judge or a confused history professor. Don't let their degree status intimidate you, or their expertise in croissants and tailored suits. Just speak up with the truth and hold their feet to the fire.